We're recording. All right, well, I'm going to kick things off. I think people will continue to filter in over the next few minutes here, but welcome everybody who's here on time to our last installment of our Energy Speaker Series. My name is Greg Stiegel. I am the Operations Director for Renewable Energy Alaska Project, and I'm excited to bring you this final event where we'll be talking about a renewable portfolio standard for Alaska. I'd like to start by just acknowledging the land that we're going to be talking about here. REAP staff live and work throughout the entire state of Alaska, and we just like to recognize the stewardship that Native Alaskans have had over these lands for thousands of years. I'd like to invite everybody to introduce yourself using the chat feature at the bottom of your screen and let us know which native lands you're coming from. If you're unsure, there's a little link here that you could go to, native-land.ca, and you'll be able to easily identify which native lands you're on. So go ahead, use the chat function when you're chatting. Be sure to select that you're sending this chat to everybody. I think it automatically just sends it to the host and panelists. So send it to everybody so we can all see where you're coming from. Feel free to let us know if you're affiliated with an organization or company of sorts as well. While folks are doing that, I'll just take care of a couple quick housekeeping items. We are recording this webinar. We'll be posting it on our YouTube page, and I'll be sure to send the link to that in a follow-up email. So you'll be able to share this with anybody who you think might be interested or somebody who couldn't make it today but would like to learn more. You'll have that link in your inbox tomorrow. Additionally, we'll be using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, a little bit different than a normal Zoom meeting. We have got this Q&A box, and I'd like to encourage you to ask questions as they pop up during the event. We might do our best to answer a few. We might answer a few in writing, and then we'll save a chunk of them for the end. We are going to have a good question and answer session for about the last 15 or 20 minutes or so. So be sure to ask questions as they pop up, and we'll do our best to answer all of them. And with that, I'm going to play just a short video here to introduce REAP to anybody who's not familiar.
For thousands of years, Alaskans were intimately involved with how we produced and consumed energy. Though individuals in modern society have become increasingly removed from an understanding of where the energy that powers our lives comes from, energy remains at the core of everything we do. Alaska's relationship with energy is complex and ever-evolving.
Alaska's energy history is really centered around oil and gas. We discovered oil and gas early in statehood, and we have used the revenues from oil and gas to build infrastructure all across the state. But now is a time for transition, and we really need to be thinking about the future.
Alaskans have never received a hometown discount on the oil and gas the state produces. Instead, we pay some of the highest energy costs in the country. Investments to make our buildings more energy efficient are super important. And meanwhile, the cost of renewable energy continues to plummet, with wind and solar power some of the cheapest electricity now on the planet. We need to be able to produce and consume energy here in Alaska in a sustainable and affordable way so we can flourish as a state. We also need a state energy policy to create a predictable roadmap for the clean energy future that's going to keep Alaska competitive in a very fast-changing world.
There is not in Alaska an energy policy, which is really hard to understand. In a state that's as cold as ours, in a state that the health of our people is really wrapped around energy, there needs to be public policy on this.
Alaskans love our state and our way of life, but things are changing. Where we live, how we gather, and our global climate are all shifting at a rapid pace. Since 2004, REAP has been passionately advocating for renewable energy and energy efficiency, and educating the next generation of Alaskans to better understand where our energy comes from.
REAP was looking at the ways energy can be used efficiently, focusing on renewables, public policy, and ways that we can move ahead to make energy work for our people. You simply can't accomplish what we need to unless we work together. REAP is an example of that kind of organization.
REAP fills the gap by being the voice of advocacy for clean, renewable energy. They are the go-to organization in the state of Alaska for setting energy policy.
Supporters and members of REAP understand Alaska has a unique opportunity to develop clean energy, and REAP's leading the way in this energy transition. The most important part of that transition is going to be the people who operate and maintain and optimize these systems over time. So we're putting together the K through 12, workforce development, and university sectors so we can prepare Alaskans for the clean energy jobs of the 21st century.
Alaska has a really unique role moving into a renewable energy future because it really is going to be an energy revolution. And I think that what we see is Alaska is well positioned to do something really quite remarkable. We are one of the few places on the planet that has a full suite of renewables available to us.
Alaska is being recognized for our value in the nation and in the world. The attention is on the Arctic. And so that attention is on all of us, that we do the things that will help this planet, that will help our people. We can do this together.
By taking control of our energy destiny and developing a clean energy economy, Alaskans can keep hundreds of millions of energy dollars in our state's economy every year, create a 21st century workforce, and ensure energy independence for future generations. The world is changing, and Alaska can lead the way into the future. At REAP, we know that energy's everything, and we believe that Alaska's best days are ahead of us. Join us in creating a clean energy future and learn more at alaskarenewableenergy.org.
Thanks for listening to that. And I'd like to just finish off by thanking our sponsors who are supporting this speaker series here for the fall and bringing it to you all. So thank you to SERI and Northern Alaska Environmental Center for supporting this season series. And I'll introduce our two speakers today who will be giving a rundown on proposed legislation to create a renewable portfolio standard in Alaska and some analysis of how that might work. Chris Rose will be speaking first. He's the founder and executive director for Renewable Energy Alaska Project. And following Chris will be Alan Mitchell, the founder and owner of Analysis North. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Chris. Let's stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Greg. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I am Chris Rose, the Executive Director of REAP, and I'm just going to give you a little bit of context about a renewable portfolio standard, where we've been with it over the last 18, 20 months, and where it may be going. And then I'm going to hand it off to Alan for some analysis of what a renewable portfolio standard could do for the Railbelt in particular. I guess to start out, I'd like to say that we believe Cook Inlet and South Central Alaska, the Railbelt, is all at a crossroads as far as where energy comes from. We get about 100% of the heat that we rely on in the Anchorage and Matsu areas. My own home may be an exception, but a lot of South Central gets its heat from natural gas. We get about 80 to 85%, depending on the year, of our electricity from natural gas. And that Cook Inlet gas market is a small, very tiny market, and we've never really benefited from any kind of a hometown discount. In fact, we pay some of the highest costs for natural gas historically in the country, and that has led the Railbelt to be a very expensive place for electricity, some of the highest electricity rates in the country. So we have a very high dependence on natural gas, and the diversification of our portfolio where we get our electricity is very, very important. So when we talk about a renewable portfolio standard, I'd emphasize the word portfolio. Recently in May, the supplier of most of the natural gas that we rely on in South Central Alaska, Hillcorp, announced that it may not be able to refill the contracts that the utilities currently have when those contracts end. And for some utilities like Home Electric Association, that contract for natural gas is coming up quite quickly in the scheme of things, only about 18 months from now. So we have a supplier that has most of the natural gas saying, don't count on us necessarily to supply natural gas into the future at the same levels that we've been supplying it in the past. So high prices, really a monopoly supplier who is not necessarily an entity that we can rely on in the future for natural gas, a small market that is not necessarily going to attract many other players. And it's very clear that we need to do something about our portfolio. Meanwhile, over the last 10 years, as most of you know, who've been following renewable energy costs have really plummeted. Solar's come down about 90% in the last decade. Wind's come down around 70%. The cost of battery storage has come down around 70%. And those prices we will continue to see come down. So we're looking at two different trajectories. One, higher and higher natural gas prices. One, lower and lower renewable prices. And the market is responding. In most of the country, utilities are moving toward renewable energy. 77% of all new capacity additions in 2021 were either wind or solar. That means all new power plants in the United States last year, 77% of them were wind or solar. And then, of course, in August, we had a big piece of federal legislation passed, the Inflation Reduction Act, which has a lot in it to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, including an extension of 10 years of the production and investment tax credits that have really built up and energized the renewable energy industry across the country. So we have 10 years worth of tax credits ahead of us. I think we're definitely moving in the direction of renewables from a market perspective, but it's just not happening in the Railbelt. We don't have an energy policy, as was noted by Jack A. Bear in that video. And most states that really want to promote renewables have used a mechanism like a renewable portfolio standard to get there. 29 states now in the country have a renewable portfolio standard, several territories, Washington, D.C. And a renewable portfolio standard is simply a requirement that certain milestones of certain percentages of renewable electricity be met by certain dates. And if they're not met, there can be a fine levied. There has to be a definition of the eligible resources, what is constituting renewable. And typically there's also some kind of a market to trade renewable energy credits. So if one entity is producing more renewable electricity than it needs to under the standard, it can sell those extra what we call renewable energy credits. 1 megawatt hour equals a renewable energy credit to others who may need those credits to comply. So I mentioned before, we have some of the highest electricity prices in the country right now. And so we felt that it made a lot of sense to move toward a renewable portfolio standard. Now, many people might ask, well, why didn't REAP, which supports renewable energy and has been around since 2004, propose something like this sooner? And I guess the best answer is that we didn't have an entity that could help facilitate the implementation of it until 2020, when the legislature required that an electric reliability organization be created for the Railbelt region. So an electric reliability organization now has been created. REAP has been part of that work for 2.5 years now. It's called the Railbelt Reliability Council. It was incorporated in March, and in September, the Regulatory Commission of Alaska certificated the RRC as the ERO. And one of the principal things that the Electric Reliability Organization, or the Railbelt Reliability Council, as we're calling it, has to do is do regional integrated resource planning. And that's not something that the Railbelt has ever had before. So now that we have an entity that is required to do planning, we have an entity that could actually implement an RPS. And so in 2021, REAP started looking at the possibility of what a policy framework for an RPS would look like. And through our membership, which is quite diverse and includes, I think, all of the utilities in the Railbelt, we had meetings for 6 months And we looked at all the different kinds of policy characteristics that other states have put into their RPSs. We had a lot of meetings. We went back and forth, and ultimately in September of 2021, the REAP board voted to support a policy framework that we then took to policymakers to see whether or not we could get a sponsor to introduce it. We were successful in getting a sponsor. Governor Dunleavy introduced legislation in February of this year. So he introduced it about 3 weeks into the session. And we did get some traction on this legislation. It passed through 2 committees in the House. I will have to say through a lot of changes were made to the legislation that I can talk about here in a second, but we did get the bill through some committees this year. We also were very lucky to get the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, or NREL, to pull together a study that it issued right around the same time the legislation was introduced in February, that found that 80% by 2040, 80% renewable by 2040 was doable without impacting reliability, and that clearly there would be a huge amount of natural gas savings if we were able to get to 80% renewable. What NREL did not do, but what they are proposing to do now, is quantify what the cost of getting to 80% renewable would be, and quantify what those gas savings would be. And that's a little bit of what Alan Mitchell is going to be talking about after I'm done here. So a bill was introduced this last session. And of course, it's a 2-year session in Juneau. We were in the 2nd year of the session when this bill was introduced. So it only had a few months to play before the legislative session ended in May. So now we are in this interim between sessions. Of course, we just had an election. We have some new members of the House and Senate who are coming in. And we have been working over the interim to make sure that we are going to have another sponsor to reintroduce the bill in January. REAP also went through its own exercise again this fall of looking at the legislation, looking at some of the changes that have been made in the legislation. And we have come up with some proposed amendments to the bill that we hope that would be included in any new legislation that gets introduced. I'm just going to go quickly through some of the elements of the legislation, and then I'm going to hand it off to Alan. But as I mentioned before, 80% by 2040 is where REAP came down as the standard. That's the ultimate standard in 2040. We originally had proposed there be 3 interim milestones before 2040, one in 2025, one in 2030, and one in 2035. Now that we're almost at 2023, and because the legislature itself moved that first benchmark from 2025 to 2027, after looking at it, REAP has decided that we think it makes sense to start with the first milestone being 2027, and that would be at 25%. To give you some context, we believe that right now the Railbelt's right at 15% renewable electricity. So we'd be moving from 15 to 25% renewable electricity by 2027. That's roughly 5 years from now. That would be by the end of December 31st, 2027. The next benchmark that we're proposing would be 55% by the end of 2035. So another 8 years between those benchmarks. 55% is a lift from 15, but we believe it's possible, and we believe NREL will show it's possible. We certainly see that kind of growth in other places, especially when there is a mandate. And we believe that once we get to 55%, the ship will have sailed, and I think the utilities will have been quite used to integrate renewables, and we will be able to make the 80% by 2040. So we're proposing 3 milestones now: 2027, 2035, and 2040. The utilities, or what we're calling load serving entities in the legislation, would have to develop an accounting system to verify their compliance and submit an annual report to the Regulatory Commission of Alaska. As I mentioned before, one of the elements of compliance typically has been allowance for renewable energy credits to be bought and sold within a market. One of the changes that was made in the legislation last year that we really felt was a real problem was the allowance to have these renewable energy credits come from anywhere in the state, even from utilities that were outside of the Railbelt grid. And we didn't feel like that made any sense, because we really wanted to focus this renewable energy portfolio standard on the Railbelt only. And therefore, we felt that the renewable energy credits should be coming from the Railbelt only. The exception that I think that we have, or perhaps another way to put it is a consensus that we could change that, and we would support a change to allow those renewable energy credits to come from smaller utilities around the state that receive power cost equalization. That way, allowing those smaller utilities that want to do renewables to sell their renewable energy credits into the Railbelt grid. But we didn't want, for example, existing hydro projects in Southeast Alaska to simply be able to sell their renewable energy credits into the Railbelt grid. That provides no additionality in the Railbelt, and it creates a windfall for those utilities in Southeast. One of the elements of the legislation that was introduced was the allowance that distributed energy resources, let's say rooftop solar, would count toward compliance for a load serving entity. But the way the bill was originally introduced, it would only allow for the excess energy that a rooftop customer did not use themselves, but instead sent back into the grid to be counted toward compliance. After looking at that, REAP doesn't have any reason to believe that it would make sense to do that anymore, but rather we'd want to have all of the renewable energy that's produced on rooftops count toward compliance. In fact, one of the things that we've been looking at closely over the last couple months is the fact that solar in particular has come down in price so much. It's very quick to put up, it's very fast to install, and it's one of the best ways we could get to compliance in the Railbelt grid in the short term. And the short term is important because, again, we are looking at some or all of our utility natural gas contracts ending in the next 5 years, 5 or 6 years. So it's really important that we do a lot in the next 5 or 6 years. To that end, we also are going to propose that rather than paying a fine, a load serving entity could take the same amount of money that they might owe based on noncompliance and instead plow that back into direct investments that would allow their own customers, co-op customers, to do rooftop solar or to do measurable energy efficiency investments. So we want to make sure that the fines don't just go into the general fund, but rather the monies that would ordinarily be paid as fines be used instead to actually build more renewable energy on rooftops. And as an incentive to do that even more, we are going to propose that the net metering rules that now exist in the Railbelt be changed so that annual net metering be allowed. That provides even a more incentive for people to put rooftop solar on. But we would soften it by only requiring that the utilities allow it for up to 7 years and only for new investments in rooftop solar. The non-compliance for not complying by certain dates would be $20 a megawatt hour. REAP had originally suggested $50 a megawatt hour, which is more the median figure across the country. But if we're going to go with $20 a megawatt hour, what we are saying is that in lieu of paying $20 a megawatt hour for every megawatt hour a utility was short, they could plow those monies back into investments in their customers. There are some provisions in the bill for waivers and for things, for reasons outside of reasonable control of a load serving entity. Things happen that they can't control, then the commission could look at those kinds of circumstances. Same thing with good cause for non-compliance. There's a lot of wiggle room in the statute, we believe, for utilities to provide good answers for why they might not have been able to get to the compliance by certain dates. Something that was written into the legislation that was introduced last year is an ability for the entire Railbelt grid to comply, all of the utilities, all 4 of the co-ops to comply if the whole region complies. And we feel like that makes some sense because we want the region to comply and we also want the RECs to be traded within that region. There's an exemption that we originally did not suggest, but that would allow for the first non-compliance of any of the utilities, as long as it wasn't the 2040 non-compliance date, to be waived. And so basically every utility would get a mulligan, if you will. They would have one non-compliance that they would be allowed. One of the really important things that I'll end with here is the definition of eligible resources. We originally proposed a bill that was a renewable portfolio standard that would not include things like nuclear. Nuclear was added throughout the committee process last spring in the legislature, and we would go back to the legislature this coming year and say, let's go back to an RPS. And rather than having a clean energy standard that includes nuclear, there's a lot of reasons that I'm happy to go into during Q&A about why we believe that's important. But those are the kinds of things that we looked at closely over the last couple of months as an organization. And we're hopeful that we'll have another bill introduced in January. So I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Alan. And then when Alan's finished, we will go to Q&A. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I'm going to share my screen here, make sure that works. Okay, can people see the first slide?
Yeah, that looks good.
Okay, well, great. Well, thanks for inviting me, Chris and Greg. And so my name's Alan Mitchell, company is Analysis North, been working on energy issues in Alaska for quite some time, actually grew up in Palmer. So that's a bit of my background. I've got a degree in electrical engineering, and I've done a fair amount of economic analysis in my career. So today I wanted to talk about primarily two things. So the study that Chris referred to that the National Renewable Energy Lab did, NREL, they actually looked at sort of 5 different pathways that the Railbelt could achieve 80% renewable penetration by 2040. Each pathway was sort of a different mix of technologies. What they didn't do is put any cost figures to the cost of achieving each one of those pathways, nor did they make an attempt to sort of add up the benefits over time of achieving the 80% renewables, although they did give some information on avoided fuel costs. So what I did was pick out one of those scenarios, which I believe probably will be the most cost effective. It was the scenario that relied primarily on wind and solar to get to the 80%, was their number 3, and did a little bit benefit cost analysis of that scenario. So I'm going to talk about that some today. But secondly, recently in the last few weeks here, I've been doing some work on just a general look at renewable costs of a variety of technologies and projects versus natural gas. And I do want to say that I haven't been paid by anyone to do this work. This is just my own interest and my own work. So there, and Chris has mentioned one of these studies. There's some other very important studies underway right now. So NREL is essentially doing what I did, but in much more detail, with an economic study that should come out early next year. So that's some very important work, and it's of the same sort of essence of what I'm going to present today, but will clearly be in much more detail. Secondly, Alaska Center for Energy and Power, ACEP, is doing a Railbelt decarbonization study. And they're sort of looking at ways of achieving, net zero carbon emissions in the Railbelt. A big element of that is obviously using renewable generation to avoid fossil fuel generation, and also looking at additional electrification to reduce fossil fuel use for end uses that aren't currently electricity. So those are 2 important studies that should be upcoming within the year. Okay, let's see. There we go. Yeah, so this is a graph that summarizes the results of my first thing I mentioned, which is the cost benefit analysis of the NREL solar wind scenario. And I do want to point out, lower right hand corner of the slide, there's quite a bit more. Well, there's the actual spreadsheet that does this analysis is on my website. So if you go to analysisnorth.com at the link in the lower right, you can find that work. So what I did was, if I looked at both the costs of implementing the solar wind scenario, and then the benefits added up over the life of these technologies for that scenario. So the red bar on the graph represents the total investment required to do the solar wind scenario, which comes out to about $3.2 billion. In current day dollars. And then the right bar on the graph shows that if you were to add up the identified fuel savings from that scenario and offset by some operating costs, you get a total benefits of $6.7 billion. So obviously a very good relationship between benefits and costs. So that was a 3.2 billion. If you look at the 3.2 billion investment, about 72% of it was wind investment. And for my estimate of the cost of implementing the wind, I used 1.94 times the national average capital cost per kW for wind plants. And that 1.94 value came from an analysis of the Golden Valley Eva Creek wind project, which was brought online, I think, around 2012. So I looked at that. I looked at the cost of that project relative to the national average cost at that time. And the relationship was about a 1.94. I think there are a number of reasons why that's a very conservative estimate, but that's what I used. For the solar, I used a 1.46 multiplier based upon some existing solar projects up here and some public statements about costs of proposed solar projects. So that's how I got to the capital cost number. I did say that the benefits, the present value of the benefits added up over the life of the investment is primarily fuel savings, but I did attempt to estimate the operating costs of the renewable plants, and I removed that from the benefit calculation. So that totaled 6.7. So finally, if you look at those two bars, you could double the capital costs and still this package of wind solar investments would show net benefits over its life. If you take the 3.2 billion cost and you double it to 6.4, there still is some net margin of benefits beyond cost. So this is a very attractive economic package here. So just a few of the assumptions that went into this. I took exactly from the NREL study the amount of wind and solar investment, not investment, but capacity that is required to achieve the scenario. So they concluded you needed 800 megawatts of wind and roughly 455 megawatts of solar. So that came straight from their study. They also identified a fuel savings over time, and they from the investment, and they came to a value of savings in 2040, and so I used their fuel savings numbers, which were based upon an Alaska Energy Authority fuel price forecast. So I didn't do any fuel price forecasting. Alaska Energy Authority did that, and I used those values directly. Also, NREL said in conversations with the utilities determined that there were already a number of battery energy storage and transmission upgrades in the Railbelt being planned, and that those were going to occur no matter whether this renewable transition occurred or not. So there really weren't any transmission line upgrades or core transmission line upgrades or battery energy storage investments required for the base case. And I should point out that this achievement of 80% renewable penetration, NREL demonstrated that you don't need long-term seasonal storage to achieve that. Because you're not trying to achieve 100%, you have existing hydro capacity like Bradley Lake, you have existing gas-fired generation that can kind of ramp up and down and accommodate the variability of wind and solar. So they did not find the need to install, for example, a very large pumped hydro project to make all this possible. Just for modeling simplicity, and this is something NREL will do a much more detailed job of, I assumed all the solar wind investment occurred in 2035, which is kind of the midpoint of the investment horizon for the projects. I also then added up fuel savings over 22 years, which now that I do some further research, it looks like many people assign a 30-year life to both wind and solar projects. So I believe this is a very conservative estimate of the range of time that benefits will occur. So these are, there were a number of things I didn't consider in the analysis. One, I used wind and solar costs from sort of today's values. As Chris pointed out, solar costs has declined about 85% since 2010 when you adjust for inflation. Wind is, and these numbers are a little different than Chris. We have maybe a little different sources. Wind costs have declined 65%. I didn't assume any further decline in those costs between now and when my 2035 investments occurred. I also didn't escalate fuel prices beyond general inflation past 2040. So I stopped any natural gas price escalation beyond 2040. So that's a conservative assumption. I didn't assign any benefits to avoided carbon. So I didn't assume that we're avoiding some carbon tax, nor did I try to quantify any just benefits of the carbon reduction. And I also didn't include any sort of production tax credit, investment tax credit, or federal subsidies for these projects. And on the negative side, I did not assign any integration costs to including the wind and solar in the grid. The wind and solar is obviously a variable renewable source that you can't control when the output is, and there are adjustments that will be needed in terms of operation of the grid to accommodate that energy. As I said before, there was some assumption already about battery energy storage that'll be in place to help accommodate for the variability. So that was my assumption there. So that's the end of my discussion of that project. So then I have recently tried to lay out a little more generalized analysis that looks at a variety of energy sources, even some beyond wind and solar. And so this graph is an attempt at summarizing that work. So there are two things that I'm trying to present in this graph. So on the far right-hand column, the green bubbles are my estimate of the sort of maximum contribution each one of these technologies could make to the Railbelt generation. And there are I put some limits on that contribution. There's clearly enough wind and solar in the Railbelt to generate enough energy for the entire Railbelt load. So both of those could be 100%. However, that would require one of two things. Either you'd have to have some long-term storage for, take the example of solar. Obviously, we don't get solar in the wintertime. You would have to store up solar from summer to winter to get that to happen. Alternatively, you'd have to overinvest in a bunch of these technologies and overproduce in many days in order that you had enough wind and solar in the other days. So I didn't consider those sort of more extreme scenarios. What I looked at here is, let's say that we have sufficient storage to deal with daily variations. And if so, how much can these technologies contribute? And you can see that I calculated a max wind contribution of about 48% of the Railbelt generation and about 40% for solar. and then so on down the line there for the other technologies and projects listed. So that's what's going on in the right-hand column. In the bars, the blue bars and the red bars you see there are an attempt to estimate what's called the levelized cost of generation for each one of those technologies. And here it's expressed in cents per kilowatt hour for the generation. And it's worth saying that, you know, we pay about 20 cents per kilowatt hour for electricity in the Railbelt. It's only a fraction of that is the cost of the actual generation to produce the electricity. So what we're looking at here is just generation costs. It doesn't include distribution, transmission, et cetera. But this is sort of the relevant thing to look at when you're trying to determine whether a renewable generation technology is competitive with existing generation. So I'd like to start at the bottom of the graph, the natural gas bar, the red bar at the bottom, and I'm showing a range there from 6.6 cents to about 12 cents. I am meaning to focus, I mean this bar to kind of be focused on Chugach electric generation, which is the most efficient generation, most efficient natural gas generation in the Railbelt. The natural gas generation in both MEA and HEA is less efficient. So I'm focused on sort of the most efficient utility. When I look at Chugach's efficiency and their fuel cost with the caveat here, and add in a little bit of variable O&M, I come to the conclusion that their current sort of avoided cost, which I'm sure I'll get some dispute from them on, is about 6.6 cents per kilowatt hour. What I am doing that they will debate, I think, is I'm ignoring they own a gas field, and in my opinion, that's sort of a fixed amount of gas, and any sort of variable demand in gas is going to have to come from their Hillcorp sources. And if you look at the Hillcorp prices right now, and again, adding in a little bit of variable O&M, you can calculate this 6.6 cent number. On the other end of that bar is a 12 cent per kilowatt hour generation number, which is consistent with if the scenario where at some point we might have to import liquid natural gas. If, as Chris said, if we start running out of Cook Inlet gas, the alternative is to import liquid natural gas. Mark Foster did some work on this and came up with this number around $15 per million BTUs, including some storage and regasification costs. If you have to make electricity from $15 liquid natural gas, it's going to cost about 12 cents per kilowatt hour. So that's the low-high range on the natural gas costs there. But now I'd like you to focus on the renewable technologies, and in particular the top three there. So my estimates for wind generation costs are from 5.2 to 8.6 cents per kilowatt hour. You see the 6.6 dash line going up there, and it makes it quite clear that wind is cost competitive with natural gas generation right now. I've marked on that bar a Fire Island Phase 2 expansion number that came from 5 years ago. About 5 years ago, the Fire Island Phase 2 expansion was offered at a 6.2 cent per kilowatt hour rate. So that's the little dashed line in the wind bar. And again, all this is quite competitive with 6.6 cents gas. If you move down to the solar bar, my range is 5.8 to 7.4. The Houston Solar Project, which is inked a contract already, and I've got a whole nother slide on here in a minute, got inked at 6.7 cents per kilowatt hour. So very near it's being sold to Matanuska Electric, where the avoided cost is higher, but it's very near, in my opinion, what the Chugach Electric avoided cost is. Joel Groves gave a presentation for REAP related to small hydro projects in the Railbelt. He identified a package of 100 megawatts of small hydro projects from his low to high cost estimate on that package, I get a range of about 4.5 to 10 cents per kilowatt hour, which also appears that a number of those projects are cost effective. The next project down is the Dixon Diversion Hydro Project, which is currently being investigated by the Alaska Energy Authority and the Railbelt utilities. A very broad range of cost and production estimates for that project. So it's nothing is very certain, but you know, it looks like the average cost of that project is in the 15 to 20 cent per kilowatt hour range. So definitely higher than these other technologies. And I think it's worth pointing out that the energy from that project is only about 3% of the Railbelt generation needs. I used on the Susitna project shown next there, I used some cost estimates from Steve Colt to come up with that range. And then I've got some numbers on Mount Spur. But you know, the bottom line is these top three technologies, the small hydro, wind, and solar, have me pretty excited, and they look like they're very cost competitive with natural gas right now. I guess what has me a bit disappointed, however, is that the excitement, at least amongst the Alaska Energy Authority and the local utilities, seems to be with the Dixon Diversion Hydro Project, which in my mind does not look nearly as attractive as the wind, solar, and small hydro. Yet, unfortunately, a lot of our state resources are headed in that direction. So
Alan, I just want to give a quick time check. We got just under 15 minutes left. So if you want to maybe, and I think you got one more slide left. If you want to kind of speed through that one, we do have a good chunk of questions coming in. I want to make sure we have a little bit of time.
Okay, yeah, and I probably should have realized how long I was going to talk on that last slide. But okay, this is really my last slide, and I will try to make it quick, but I think it's important. This is cost over time. The green line on the graph is an inked contract. I mean, there's no uncertainty in this Houston Solar 6 megawatt project, what it's going to cost the utilities to buy that energy. It starts out at 6.7 cents a kilowatt hour on the left side there. It's got an escalator of 1.5%, which is less than what inflation is expected to be. So that's the trajectory of what that project is going to cost MEA. The red shaded band is my natural gas price, generation price estimate of 6.6 cents, escalated over time at a couple different rates because it's really uncertain. I mean, this is one huge advantage of the Houston Solar or an IPP provided project. There's certainty in the future of the price of the generation resource. So if you look at what natural gas price has done in the last 10 years, and you use that escalation rate, which is about 3.4%, you get the bottom of that red shaded curve as a generation cost. If you look at the 20-year escalation rate, that's up around 5 or more than 5%. You get the sort of top end of the curve. So you can see that the Houston Solar project is an incredible deal relative to continuing with natural gas generation. Okay, so I will wrap it up and at least leave a few minutes for questions.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Alan, and thank you, Chris, for those presentations. Alan, you could maybe
yes,
sharing your screen and we'll go full screen for us for the questions. And I'll just start ticking through a few of these. We got just over 10 minutes, so I want to make sure we get to some of these. First up, in the updated legislation, can the utility fines be put towards interconnection or storage costs that support new utility scale renewable energy projects? That might be a good answer for you, Chris.
Well, the new legislation has not been reintroduced yet, so I think there's always a possibility to craft language that could include that. I think what the language that REAP has settled on for now is that a LSE, a load serving entity or utility, could invest money in lieu of fines in rooftop solar or energy efficiency for one of their customers. And so it depends how you would define that kind of project for that to happen. But for a rooftop solar project, that would include the cost of connecting it to the grid.
Thanks, Chris. And this one is for Alan. What was the fuel price scenario behind the preliminary benefit cost analysis?
It was a scenario put forth by the Alaska Energy Authority. It essentially worked out to about a 2% escalation over time beyond general inflation. So if you looked at my last slide where I had kind of the red shaded range of the natural gas price forecast, it was somewhere in the middle of that.
Thanks. Another one for you here, Alan. Is the 3.2 billion number you quoted, does that include financing costs over the life of the investments?
No, that's the upfront cost. So I took the net present value approach to do an economic analysis, which if you look at the upfront cost, but then you discount the future savings back to that value, then you've done a proper economic analysis. The discount rate that I used to bring the fuel savings back to the present was 3% real, 3% beyond inflation, which is exactly the discount rate that the Alaska Energy Authority uses for all their analysis.
Thank you. So next question, I believe you answered, what is the lifetime for solar and wind to obtain the savings? I think you answered that you plugged in 22 years, but it could be up to 30 years.
Yeah, the NREL, both the NREL assumptions for wind are 30 years and solar are 30 years. And the reality is a big wind development where you have spent a lot of money on a transmission line to get there and a road to get there, and you have to do site prep. I mean, the reality is that site's going to produce energy for a very long time. The wind turbines, even if they end their life, they're going to get replaced with other wind turbines. So
sure. This might be a good one to start with you, Chris. If the present value net benefits are so vastly positive, why do you believe that the Railbelt utilities are not chomping at the bit to launch this effort even without an RPS?
Well, that's a great question. I think Alan pointed out that unfortunately, most of the excitement right now seems to be focused on the Dixon diversion, which on its face looks like a very, very expensive project per kilowatt hour relative to some of these other technologies. I think historically there's been quite of a self-build bias by the utilities. They would like to build projects themselves. None of the utilities right now have a balance sheet that allows them to build much more. So that would require them to contract with independent power producers, which is losing a little bit of control there. So I think there's an element of that in what's going on. But I can't quite tell you what the answer is because, REAP is not inside the utilities' heads. It does seem on its face that it would make sense for them to be moving in this direction, particularly because the Inflation Reduction Act now has extended those tax credits for 10 years, which Alan pointed out he did not assume was going to happen when he did this benefit cost analysis. So that's going to be even better based on those 30% tax credits.
yeah, I guess the only thing I'd maybe add to that is I suspect that there definitely are some operational changes that need to occur in order to allow for a lot of variable wind and solar generation. I think the amount we've done so far haven't involved many changes, but I'm sure there's some concern about having to change to to deal with variations of wind and solar.
Yeah, and there are utilities that are looking at wind and solar right now, but there has not been any large scale, let's just say over 10 megawatt wind or solar project commissioned in the Railbelt for 10 years now. So even though I think there's more interest right now, there hasn't been any commitment to do anything more than what we've seen recently. The operational changes that Alan mentioned include having some kind of a system operator, I believe, that would manage the Railbelt as a single load balancing area. That would make it a lot easier for variable renewable electrons to move up and down. Now that's required now by the Regulatory Commission for the Anchorage area in MEA. That's a tight power pool, but we'd love to see a single load balancing area with economic merit order dispatch for the entire grid. That may require some of these transmission upgrades that are assumed in the NREL study that have not yet been completed.
Thanks. This next question here, both of you might want to chime in on. Has analysis been done to determine how much transmission upgrades will cost and how that would impact rates if it has to be paid for by the utilities?
Well, I can mention that some of these transmission upgrades that are moving forward are being built with bonds that Alaska Energy Authority and the utilities are working on that would essentially leverage money that the utilities would have paid the state back for their share of Bradley Lake. So there has been some analysis for some of those transmission upgrades. The integrated resource plan that the Electric Reliability Organization needs to do will look very closely at what transmission is actually necessary and what the costs are going to be. But unfortunately, that integrated resource plan, the first one that the Railbelt Reliability Council completes, probably won't be done for a couple of years at least. So we're at an interesting situation where we clearly need to move fast, and yet we're not moving very fast, nor do the institutions that we've created seem to allow us to move as fast as we need to move.
Yeah, and I guess, I mean, I would just emphasize, I think it's really premature to make large investments in transmission without having done the integrated resource plan. I mean, I think it's really important to know where your generation, where your cost-effective generation resources are before you start spending a lot of money on transmission.
Well, likewise, it's disappointing that there's so much effort to be put into what could be up to a $500 million hydro project in the Dixon diversion outside of an integrated resource plan. So that's extremely disappointing. That again seems to be the project that has got a lot of traction right now.
Thanks. I'm going to try to get a couple questions out of the chat here. Suzanne asked, should the levelized cost of energy include the cost of the natural gas plant itself as it does with the renewable projects?
Yeah, I mean, I'll hit that one. That's a tricky question to answer. I mean, I'll put forth a scenario where I think it does, and it's a significant number. If you look at what it costs to build a South Central, the Chugach South Central power plant, and then you amortize it across the electricity produced by that plant, it's 2.5, 3 cents a kilowatt hour on top of the fuel. Those plants have already been built, the costs are sunk. However, I mean, if electric demand, let's just say we get a whole bunch of electric vehicles, it may be a while before heat pumps show up, but if electric demand goes up, even though we have a lot of generating capacity in the rail belt, that there will be a desire to build more efficient generating capacity, which means those investments in new plants will have to be made. And so there's a scenario where wind and solar could, reduce the energy demand and avoid those investments. And therefore, that's a scenario where I think wind and solar should get some credit for the fact that it's avoiding 2 to 3 to 4 cent per kilowatt hour investment in new plants in addition to the fuel.
Sorry, I'm muted there. Sorry. I think we have maybe just one quick question here. I'll give it to you, Chris, from Mike Music. Is there an identified champion in the legislature to carry this legislation for this year?
Well, I think there are several legislators who were either recently reelected or held their seats from before who are interested and who were supportive last year that will be approaching. And the governor got reelected too, and he was the one who introduced it last year. So I think we do have some champions in the legislature and in the executive branch that are going to want to move this forward again.
Great. Well, we are at the top of the hour here, so I just want to thank everybody for joining us, taking your lunch hour to hear a little bit about this RPS legislation and some of this analysis. And thank you to Chris and Alan for sharing your time and knowledge. So appreciate everybody being here, and hope everybody has a good rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone. Take
Yeah,
care.
thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Care.